Well, Thanet's interesting because when I visited before, it was like visiting a northern town where it's been, indeed, industrialisation has hit it hard. So you've got a lack of industry, lack of jobs, and lack of well-paid jobs, and you've got high levels of pockets of deprivation, to be frank. And I know people have suffered hard, particularly in recent recessions. And the whole point about our government, when we take power in 2020, is that we'll rebuild our economy, but we'll rebuild it fairly. And the whole point of that is, how do you rebuild your economy in a modern world? You invest. And that means funding schools, it means funding colleges, making sure you have a real apprentice scheme, not one that's just a phony one where people don't get the skills, they're just kept off the dole, but you actually invest so that they get proper training. But you make sure that investment is done through, well, we're setting up a state investment bank, so that that is done in a way which pays dividends to the public, not to the private sector. So skills, you invest in infrastructure. But the most important thing now is to rebalance our economy, to make sure we rebuild our manufacturing base. I just think Thanet could be one of those places where, as a microcosm, we could really pilot a lot of these schemes that we want to do in 2020. In this country, because we're dominated by the finance sector, because people are into short-term profits and profiteering, they're not interested in long-term investment. So that results in inequality. Large numbers of people living in poverty, others working all as God sent just to survive, and then a small minority, 1 or 2%, who make a fortune. I'll just give an example. If you're a director of a FTSE index company, which in other words some of the larger companies, in the first week of January, in that 1 week, you'll have earned the wages of the average worker who will earn that for the whole of the year. That's a scandal. Thanet has demonstrated to the rest of the country just how you can campaign against UKIP, and I think you've been a splendid example. You identify the problems that people are experiencing and you come up with practical solutions. What UKIP does, it identifies the problems and then blames migration, and then blames anybody else apart from the system itself. And I think the campaign that's done in that, I think, has been tremendous. You've identified the problems, you've offered alternatives, and in that way you've beaten their argument in terms of demonstrating how irrational it is, and I think that's the way to do it. You've been an example for the rest of us campaigning, but we've got to confront them. We can't stand away from them. They've got to be exposed for what they are. And basically, in every recession, you always have some form of right-wing organisation like this come up, and they always blame some individual group in that way, and that's what UKIP have done. It's traditional extreme right-wing politics to find a scapegoat instead of the reality of looking at the system. Look, if I read the newspapers at the moment, I'd be worried about us, to be frank, because what we're confronting is the establishment. We're taking on the mass might of the establishment, and we're challenging them. Part of that establishment are the newspapers, and I have to say as well TV and radio too, because they take their stories from the newspapers. And the reason they're doing that is because we're challenging their power. All of a sudden, people who represent the 99% of the population are taking on the powerful 1%, and they don't like it. So they're using every influence and every power they can to throw at us, and that includes the media. And what do? Well, we provide an alternative narrative. And how do we do that? First of all, we do it by the spoken word. Meetings all around the country now, packed out. And I think it's been overwhelmingly successful in mobilising people and lifting their spirits and giving people hope. The second thing is, the one thing that we've got now that we've never had before is social media. So we're creating our own media now. We're not dependent on the Sun. We're not dependent on all the other press that are coming against us. Even the sort of supposed liberal papers like The Guardian are having a go because we're challenging them. They've been too comfortable for too long in not addressing the real issues of our economic and social system. What Jeremy's election did, for the first time in maybe a generation, it gave people hope of radical change which would address the issues that they're confronting on a daily basis. And I think we're getting there. I've visited Thanet now on a number of occasions. I know the problems that it's got. I know the problems, economic problems. I know the high levels of deprivation that there are and issues around unemployment that have faced people. But I tell you what makes me proud is that the people in Thanet have stood up and said, look, we're not going to take it. We're going to campaign and we're going to transform our society. I think Thanet has got a real future. And it'll be one of those areas that people will look to and think, actually, some of these campaigns started here. So be proud to be part of Thanet.